Hello, everyone joining us on YouTube today, and welcome to the second annual Douglas Week, and welcome to day 2. I'm Dr. Caroline Dunham-Schroeder, and I'm the founder of Douglas Week, and we're very, very happy that you are all here to join us for this fantastic week, like the week of events, but also for this event today here. And I am here joined by my wonderful colleague and friend, and also Douglas Week co-founder, Sarah McCready, and our lovely speaker today, Dr. Hannah Rose Murray.
Hello, thank you so much for joining us today. We're absolutely delighted to welcome you to this week of celebration of the great abolitionist Frederick Douglass and other changemakers. Our aim is not only to commemorate the history of Frederick Douglass and others, but also to discuss contemporary issues of identity, race, independence, and equal rights around the world. And during this event today, we will talk about Douglass's time in the British Isles. The event today is called "There Could Be No Peace Where There Was Injustice: Frederick Douglass in Britain and Ireland, 1859 to 1860, and 1886 to 1887.
Yeah, and I'm very much looking forward to the talk. But before we start, I just wanted to say that this year, in addition to these virtual discussions and talks like this one, which are absolutely wonderful, and we are able to reach this bigger audience that way, but we also have in-person events, which is really, really great, and we're so looking forward to them. And that's in Cork, Ireland, and in Washington, D.C. And D.C., obviously, where Douglass and his family moved about 150 years ago in 1872, and where they lived for more than 20-something years, I think.
So we're thrilled that we're able to host this mix of in-person and virtual events like this one today, because this also gives us the opportunity to connect with people all over the world. So wherever you're joining us from, welcome. And if you're watching this and you want to know a little bit more, you can follow us by looking for and using the hashtag Douglas Week. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel. In case you missed any events, all of our events throughout Douglas Week will be recorded and available for viewing in the coming days. So don't forget to check out our full program on our website. That's www.douglasweek.org. And so almost all of our events will be live or on YouTube, and you can rewatch events during the week and, of course, afterwards.
Yeah, exactly. Go check out our website, and we hope that you enjoy our next Douglas Week event, this one right now. And in a second, I will hand over to the very inspiring Dr. Hannah Rose Murray. Hannah Rose, she received a PhD from the University of Nottingham, and she's a Leverhulme ECR Fellow at the University of Edinburgh. Her research focuses on the recovery of African-American oratorical, literary, and visual testimony in Britain during the 19th century. Her first book, Advocates of Freedom, African-American Transatlantic Abolitionism in the British Isles, was published in 2020 by Cambridge. And her accompanying website, you have to go check that out, attempts to map as many Black activists speaking locations sort of across Britain and in Ireland too. And I'm sure Hannah Rose will talk about that too. Her second book, which she co-authored with John Kaufman McKivigan, focuses on Frederick Douglass in Britain and Ireland, and that's what we're going to hear about today. And it came out last year. So in April 2021, and make sure you check that out as well. And I'm also super delighted to say that Hannah Rose is also a member of the Douglas Week team. So thank you so much for that, Hannah Rose. And it's an honor and a pleasure, as always, to have you here with us today. And thank you for being here and taking the time to talk with us and everyone listening and watching today. And happy Douglas Week, everyone. And Hannah Rose, over to you.
Happy Douglas Week. Thank you so much to you both for that very, very, very generous and kind introduction. It is an honor to be here, and thank you for inviting me to speak. So thank you so much. So what I want to do today in my talk is to really examine Frederick Douglass's relationship with Britain and Ireland, in particular through his second and third visits, sort of held between 1859 and 1860, and then 1886 to 1887. So there's been so much brilliant research into Douglas's first trip that he made to Britain and Ireland between 1845 and 1847, particularly his experience in Ireland, the publication of his narrative, his autobiography there, his relationship with Irish abolitionists. So I just want to sort of refocused this lens to talk about, in comparison, the sort of relatively sort of ignored transatlantic journeys or later journeys. So before I start, I just want to issue a content warning. I'm going to be talking about concepts, racial issues, so racial violence and slavery. So I'm going to get straight into it. So Frederick Douglass was actually planning to visit Britain a second time at some time around sort of the late 1850s. But in the summer of 1859, the radical white abolitionist John Brown, pictured here on the right-hand side, launched an assault on Harper's Ferry in Virginia in an attempt to spark an uprising of the enslaved population. And Brown had visited Douglass for a couple of weeks while planning this raid, this insurrection. So Douglass was actually knowledgeable of what Brown was going to do. And Virginian authorities were quick to involve Douglass. They found letters from Douglass in Brown's possession after Brown was captured. So Douglass was implicated in this failed rebellion. So he was actually forced to flee first to Canada and then to Britain for his own safety. And he barely escaped arrest actually by US Marshals, but he managed to board the steamer, the Nova Scotian, and he landed in Liverpool in England on the 24th of November, 1859. And at that point, he was welcomed by fierce friend and abolitionist Julia Griffiths Crofts and her husband, Henry Crofts. They had settled in Staffordshire, where Griffiths had sort of continued her anti-slavery work. She'd gone to stay in the Douglass household a few years before. So just while we're talking about key abolitionists for Douglass during this trip, he also stayed with the Richardson family. You can see here Anna Richardson on the left-hand side. On the bottom right, there is a heritage plaque on the Richardson family house in Newcastle, where they lived. Douglass had stayed with the Richardsons in his previous trip in 1846, and the Richardson family had been instrumental in raising donations to enact the legal purchase of Douglass's freedom. So by the time he returned to the US in 1847, he was legally a free man. And the top right image is Nelson Street, where the music hall stands and once stood, and that's where Frederick Douglass spoke when he was here in Newcastle for this second visit. So throughout his journey during this second visit, in his speeches in Newcastle and also beyond, Douglass was arguing some of the similar things that he'd been talking about in his first visit. So he talks about how it would take the strength of the international community that would end US slavery. So he said that slavery was a system so well calculated to blind and darken the moral sense of those who were brought immediately in contact with it, so paralyzing to the arm uplifted to strike it down, so corrupting to all the institutions in its vicinity, that the powers to overthrow it did not exist in its more immediate locality. So Douglass is arguing there that essentially he had to travel abroad to try and gather the momentum from the international community to shine a light on slavery in the US southern states, and it would essentially burn away from the land. But what's really interesting in terms of comparing the speeches from Douglass's second visit to his former visit, in this second visit, he was slightly more critical about racism that he experienced in England in particular. And he chastised the British public for what he described as non-intervention towards slavery. So in a speech in Sheffield, Douglass directly connected the British people through their consumption of goods produced by enslaved labor. So by the early 1850s, 90% of the cotton that was coming into Liverpool was coming from the US South. It was slave grown, essentially. And Douglass talked about this in terms of language of not only boycotting, but also corruption. And he really laid the blame for slavery at the feet of his British audiences. So he was a lot harsher about these sorts of connections than he was during his first trip, which is understandable because it's over a decade later. So afterwards, again, in Dundee, in another meeting, he, according to one newspaper correspondent, strongly condemned the pro-slavery feeling. He said that it actually began to poison parts of British society. And in particular, he mentions the popularity of racist minstrel shows, which were incredibly popular in British and Irish society during that time. He'd actually mentioned it during his first visit as well, but he'd really noticed an increase in its popularity and an increase in the number of minstrel shows. And in some meetings, he put that down to pro-slavery Americans coming over and influencing British opinion. In other meetings, he specifically targeted the racism of British societies. And in one meeting, he actually went so far as to say that Britain's proud boast of liberty could not be made, because in his words, American prejudice might be found in the streets. And he described the pestiferous nuisance Ethiopian minstrels who brought here the slang phrases, the contemptuous sneers, all originating in the spirit of slavery. So the other thing that Douglas was talking about in his speeches is that he was defending John Brown. So in the first few speeches that he gave while he was staying with Julia Griffiths Crofts was sort of urging him to be a little bit cautionary about mentioning John Brown. The whole event had actually sparked a lot of debate in Britain. It was a very divisive issue. And Crofts argued that if Douglas was to bring it up in every speech, it might sort of create divisions within the anti-slavery meeting. But after a couple of meetings, Douglas couldn't bear the silence any longer after he was reading so many erroneous reports in the British press about John Brown. And in one meeting that he gave in Leeds in December 1859, he spoke alongside the radical Black abolitionist Sarah Parker Remond, a radical advocate and freedom fighter for social justice, feminism, equality. And Remond was defending John Brown, and Douglas also defended John Brown. And I'll just read you an excerpt from this speech where he says, "It might be a crime for a man on the deck of a pirate ship to strike down the captain and take her into the nearest port, where the victims of piracy might be set at liberty, and in no other sense were Brown's acts a crime. English people were apt to look upon Brown as one who had gone into a peaceable neighbourhood and had there created a deep-seated discontent and disturbance, but this was simply a picture of fancy. John Brown disturbed no such neighbourhood as this. He entered Virginia not when she was in a state of peace, but when she was in a state of war. For if a state of war existed anywhere on the face of the globe, it did at this moment on the soil of the Southern States. Slavery was itself an insurrection, and the slaveholders were an armed band of insurgents against the just rights and liberties of their fellow men." So in this really powerful speech, Douglas is essentially saying that Brown wasn't some rebel who had disturbed the peace with sort of malice or murderous intentions, because slavery by its very definition and existence represented violence, it represented war. I mean, blood was spilled on an hourly basis through torture, violence, rape, as Douglas described in his words, at the touch of the slaveholder's scourge. And Brown, she sacrificed himself on the altar of freedom. And in doing that, he really exposed enslavers' war crimes against Black people to an international community. And that's the type of language in which newspaper correspondents should be describing Brown as a hero. And to sort of counter how violent in a way that language sounded in a kind of performative technique to his audiences, Douglas reiterated that he said he was a peace man. And again, I'll read you what he was meaning by this. So, I am a peace man, but my theory of peace was this: the man who did most to establish justice on this earth was the true man of peace. There could be no real peace where there wasn't justice. Let enslavers dream of death when they sleep. Let them suspect death in their dish and in their drink. For when a man reduces his fellow man to slavery, when he takes from him the right of speech, when he blots out from him the word of God, when he darkens his soul, when he takes that name that might be inscribed in the Lamb's book of life and sacrilegiously inscribes it in his ledger, and when he declares that he shall have no means of escape, but that his children and his children's children after him shall linger in hopeless bondage, then I should say that if the slaveholder did welter in his blood, he had his own crimes to thank for it. So again, a very, very powerful and very radical speech from Douglas there, outlining his vision of not only anti-slavery, but also how enslavers' crimes were a result of their own sadism. Now, unfortunately, this 6-month trip to Britain in 1859 and early 1860 was tragically cut short when he received the heartbreaking news that his youngest daughter, Annie, had died 3 weeks previously. And an article in Douglas's paper, the Douglas Monthly, mentioned that at Annie's funeral, frequent allusions were made to the father of little Annie, so far away, who would be so sad to be present, and yet still more sad to be absent. So Douglas returned in sort of early spring of 1860. And obviously the following year, it was the beginning of the US Civil War, which Frederick Douglass played a huge part in encouraging Black soldiers to enlist in the Union Army later on during the conflict. And as Douglass and other Black abolitionists had predicted for years, this huge conflict, this civil war, was a result of slavery. And again, an editorial in the Douglass Monthly argued that the simple way then to put an end to the savage and dissoluting war now waged by the slaveholders is to strike down slavery itself, the primal cause of that war. Now, in terms of the British Isles, they were sort of left in a bit of or Britain as a whole was left in a bit of a dilemma of how to respond. So the Union blockade in 1862 actually disrupted Britain's supply of cotton, Britain's supply of goods produced by enslaved labor that I mentioned earlier. And this caused a real transatlantic crisis where thousands of British men and women faced unemployment and poverty because those goods, particularly cotton, wasn't coming to Britain in the same quantities. So that meant that factories were closed, and that meant obviously that men and women were unable to work. So the brilliant historian Richard Blackett has a really fantastic book about this called Divided Hearts, Britain and the American Civil War. And he talks about in that book how sort of no other international event had such an amazing sort of effects on the economic and political life of Britain as the US Civil War. And he talks about the cotton famine. He talks about how tens of thousands of people were unable to work because of the war. Now, British politicians were deeply concerned, obviously, about this. They were also, some of them actually admired the South's calls for a new independent republic. They admired the new Confederacy, but many politicians, again, were worried about sort of continuing and long-lasting effects of the cotton famine on British economy. So they were wavering about whether Britain and the British government should actually formally recognise the Confederacy. And Frederick Douglass was deeply concerned at this wavering position towards the Union. So in response to a friend's request, which was probably Julia Griffiths Crofts again, Douglass wrote a literary masterpiece called The Slave's Appeal to Great Britain in 1862 that was designed to encourage British audiences to denounce slavery as the cornerstone of the Confederate Republic. So in this speech, or in this appeal, he says, "Oh, I pray you, by all your highest and holiest memories, blast not the budding hopes of these millions by lending your countenance and extending your honoured and potent hand to the blood-stained fingers of the impious slave-holding Confederate States of America. Welcome not those brazen human fleshmongers, those brokers in the bodies and souls of men who have dared to knock at your doors for admission into the family of nations. Their pretended government is but a foul, haggard, and blighting conspiracy against the sacred rights of mankind, and does not deserve the name of government. Its foundation is laid in the impudent and heaven-insulting dogma that man may rightfully hold property in man and flog him to toil like a beast of burden. Have no fellowship, I pray you, with these merciless men-stealers, but rather with whips of scorpions that scourge them beyond the beneficent range of national brotherhood." And in this appeal, this really stirring and powerful appeal, he anticipates the response of some British people, British politicians who had wavered or were wavering in their decision, or pointed to the Union's sort of lackluster promise or commitment to anti-slavery. Abraham Lincoln sort of reluctance to sort of say anti-slavery was a war aim. Douglass attacked their hypocrisy, particularly in regard to the racism that existed in the northern states and within that union. And he said, "Must you," he says to the British audience, "because the loyal states have been guilty of complicity with slavery, espouse the cause of those who are still more guilty? Must you, while you reprobate the guilty agent, embrace in the arms of your friendship the still more guilty principle? Will you lash the loyal states for their want of a genuine detestation of slavery, and yet in open day form an alliance with a brand of conspirators and thieves who have undertaken to destroy the loyal government in order to make slavery perpetual and universal on this continent? Will you stand in the way of a righteous measure because it is urged by wrong motives? Will you prevent the slave from getting his due because necessity and not a sense of moral obligation impels the payment?" So just after this appeal was published, Julia Griffiths-Cross, the fierce friend of Frederick Douglass and British abolitionist, worked feverishly to sort of amplify this particular appeal, but also Douglas's speeches throughout the Civil War, writings, letters concerning African-American soldiers in particular. In February 1863, they held a meeting in Leeds, and Crofts wrote to Douglas and she said, "It would have done your heart good to have heard the thundering shouts for liberty and the groans for slavery." But she also writes that she wishes that he could have been present to add the weight of your testimony to the guilty, the pirate Southern Confederacy. So fast forwarding a little bit more in time in terms of Douglas's relationship with the British Isles. In April 1881, Douglas signed a contract in the US with the Park Publishing Company in Hartford in Connecticut to publish his third autobiography, The Life and Times. And Douglas felt that a lot of the memories of abolition were fading, were passing with each generation, and he wanted his autobiography to inspire younger generations, raise their aspirations. He was living proof of the capacity to and capability to challenge and actually fight racism and end slavery head on. But unfortunately for Douglas, this sort of editing and publishing process proved deeply frustrating, as the Park Company edited some of Douglas's text and writings, neglected to correct errors in the text, included illustrations he hadn't sanctioned. And later that year, Douglas wrote that the company, and I quote, had marred and spoiled my work entirely. And he was trying to encourage them to essentially issue an edition without the illustrations, because he felt that a lot of the illustrations were racist in nature. And he said the company did not have a right to load the book with all manner of coarse and shocking woodcuts, such as may be found in the newspapers of the day. So there he's talking about the racist depictions of people of color in the newspapers, and this publishing company had put those illustrations in Douglas's own work. So he was absolutely disgusted with those images. Some of these errors were corrected in later editions, but many of the illustrations remained. Now, interestingly, one of the illustrations that Douglas would have been unhappy with found its way to the front cover of a British edition, which was published, edited and published by John Lobb. So this particular illustration is Frederick Douglass sort of bowing in deference to an enslaver, Lloyd. You can just about read on the gravestone. And John Lobb was a journalist. He was editor of the Christian Age magazine. He was a very savvy editor. He increased its circulation by tens of thousands within a very short space of time. And he had worked with another African-American a decade before, Josiah Henson, to sell hundreds of thousands of copies of his revised slave narrative. So Lobb had reportedly seen a copy of Douglas's autobiography. He planned to publish it. It's slightly unclear, but without Douglas's immediate consent. And in a somewhat hasty move, he informed a friendly newspaper correspondent, perhaps, as an article appeared at the end of 1881, stating that Lobb has in the press the life and times of Frederick Douglass, containing his early life as a slave, his escape from bondage, and his complete history to the present time, with many other interesting and important facts in his most eventual life. But perhaps Lobb had, at some point, finally decided to inform Douglas of his intentions, but it wasn't until February 1882 that he cabled Douglas and wrote, "Permit me to republish your life." So without asking the publisher's permission, or again, most importantly, Douglas's, he actually continued with his own version. So in view of the advanced stage of my work, which I commenced in December 1881, I resolved to complete it. Wishful also that my edition should prove to be a success, the Right Honourable John Bright MP, very famous English MP, kindly undertook to read the proof sheets. So, and considering Bright's introduction, and Lobb says, and the power I may bring to bear from the influences of my 2 weekly journals, I largely trust the work will find a sale. So somewhere along this very protracted, restrictive process, Douglas must have agreed, which would have reminded him, as another point, of the sort of racial patronization and limiting nature of the white abolitionist movement in terms of literary text. That's why Douglas was such a prolific writer. He wanted to write and own his own writing and be independent from any white abolitionist. Lobb had actually sent Douglas a letter thanking him for a list of corrections from the American edition. So again, perhaps Douglas hoped that he could, with this British version, offer a slight comparison, obviously, to the American edition that he was so unhappy with. But unfortunately, Lobb says in this letter that, quite alarmingly, Lobb had anticipated a considerable number of these errors when correcting my proofs, and such as are too late for correcting are not at all likely to dishonour your work. I venture to believe you will all be also pleased with the get-up. So again, the alteration of his literary work smacks of racial paternalism, and of course was the antithesis of what Douglas had wanted to achieve with his book and all of his writings and speeches as well. So Lobb's version contained many changes, including the English spelling of certain words, altered punctuation, the removal of certain names that British people would find unfamiliar, deletions of it in entire paragraphs concerning pro-slavery Englishmen, as well as several uncorrected mistakes from the American Park Publishing Company's edition. But again, some of the worst editorial crimes appeared on the front cover. The image I've already mentioned, but Lobb also abbreviated the work from Frederick Douglass to, you can say, Fred and a K, which Douglas would have absolutely hated. And again, I've mentioned that image of sort of deference. Douglas is bowing in deference to the grave of Colonel Lloyd, and the image sort of proved a representation of this sort of post-Civil War reunion, romantic reunionism sort of theme, rather than the sort of heroic radicalism that Douglas had shown within its pages. And Douglas obviously deeply disliked that reconciliation narrative. So the other thing about this particular work as well is that Lobb inserted numerous images and illustrations in there as well, which differed significantly from its American counterparts. He restructured the appendix and included adverts for his own journals at the back of the book. Despite Douglas's unhappiness with this book, he was writing to friends based in Britain, including one of the Richardson family, Ellen Richardson. She actually believed the book was a succinct and valuable record of the stirring events connected with slavery, and she couldn't actually see any problems with it, save Douglas's image, and she wrote as its associations with age. So she said, "I must tell thee, when I first opened the book and gazed on the frontispiece, I could but involuntarily exclaim, oh, such a change truly in Frederick Douglass, so aged, no wonder after such a life." But she did go on to praise the book and also the later edition in 1892, as she wrote, "For such a life as yours should have an ending as well as a beginning." So throughout the 1880s, British and Irish friends wrote letters, they exchanged images of each other, they continued to send financial assistance to African-American societies and African-American organizations, schools, churches, things like that. And after Douglas's first wife, Anna Murray Douglas, died in 1882, 2 years later, he remarried a white woman, Helen Pitts, in 1884. And an opportunity presented itself for them both to visit Europe for an extended honeymoon. And Douglas and his wife planned a visit sort of beyond the usual sort of 3 months that many Americans usually embarks on, perhaps unsurprising given his absence of about 26 years from his warm and cherished friends that he wrote. And he wrote in one letter, "My visit to England was in some respects sentimental. I wanted to see the faces and press the hands of some of the dear friends and acquaintances I met there over 40 years ago. Neither they nor I were as young and strong as when we were met so long ago." So on the 14th of September in 1886, the couple boarded the City of Rome steamer for their long desired and long meditated voyage at sea. So 10 days later, they arrived in Liverpool. And over the course of the week, the couple played tourists. So they attended exhibitions, they visited libraries, museums, they took day trips, including a day trip to the nearby Roman town of Chester. And on the 1st of October, they travelled down to stay with Julia Griffiths Crofts, who was by then living in Cambridgeshire. And she and Douglas and Helen Pitts Douglas visited the school where Julia Griffiths Crofts worked. He actually addressed the children there in a short speech, and he also gave a short speech at the Corn Exchange in St. Neots. But the stay with Julia was mainly a restful one. Again, they went to Cambridge sightseeing, they went to London and travelled around local villages. And after staying in St. Neots, they went to Bridport to stay with Russell and Mary Carpenter, who had been, again, fierce friends to Douglas throughout the years. They organised a lecture for him, and he spoke there in Bridport in a town hall on the 15th of October. And in this speech, he spoke about the progress that African Americans had made, the stark difference in his life between when he first arrived and spoke to a Bridport audience in 1846. And he recounted stories from his first visit to England, the purchase of his legal freedom from the Richardsons, and his second visit in 1859 as well. And while in London, the couple also played tourists as well. So they visited significant historical sites. So St. Paul's, the National Gallery, the British Museum, Madame Tussauds, Westminster Abbey, for example, but also the Tower of London. And there's a really interesting paragraph that Douglas writes in his private diary about the Tower of London and the fact that the crown jewels were held here. And he talks about British imperialism. And he says that such a contradictory place, so the Tower of London, with all its engineering of terror and death, stained by so many crimes, why was it chosen to be as the repository of the crown jewels, unless it was to illustrate the motive, object, and mainspring of many of the horrible crimes and the inhuman butcheries that have been there enacted? For next to religion, nothing has given rise to more envy, ambition, treachery, cold-blooded crimes, and brutal vengeance than the desire for these crowns, and the thirst for wealth and power represented by such crowns. So again, those comments were made in his private diary, but obviously it shows how very much where Douglas was of the hypocrisies of British conceptions of liberty, and how his speeches in 1845 represented this type of performative engagement that deliberately sort of ignored imperialist narratives when he was speaking to audiences in order to appeal to those audiences. So after spending some more time with friends, the Douglases set off for the continent, and they went through France. They stopped in Paris, and they visited museums there, art galleries, monuments, and Douglas made a visit to the National Bibliothèque, where he actually inquired whether it contained any of his books. And Douglas wrote, "In a few minutes, it was a marvel how they could lay hands on it so soon. There was laid before me the book of my bondage and my freedom, and a little tract containing a letter of mine written in 1846, in reply to one by Dr. Samuel Hanson Cox." And he was obviously fascinated and delighted when he saw his works in that library. And from there, they moved through France. They went to Italy, Rome. They visited St. Peter's Cathedral, the Forum, the Colosseum. They saw Edmonia Lewis, the African-American female sculptor. And they also saw Sarah Parker Remond, who I've already mentioned, and her sister Caroline Putnam. And again, the Douglases continued their tour of Italy. They went to Pompeii, the Amalfi Coast, Naples, where actually Douglas gave a speech in Naples. So this interesting concept of him giving a speech, and then perhaps what was lost in translation when that was translated into Italian. And actually Douglas gave another speech when he was in Cairo, when the couple visited the pyramids, Alexandria. They also went to Greece. They visited the Acropolis, and travelled through Athens as well. So when they returned to England, Helen Pitts Douglas received a letter to say that her mother was incredibly unwell. So she actually travelled back to the US to be with her, leaving Frederick Douglass behind. And that left him, or gave him, an opportunity to visit some other friends as well. So he, in his words, wanted to see those who, when I was a stranger, took me in, when I was in exile, sheltered me, when I was poor, helped me, and when I was a slave, ransomed me. And he met few of his original friends from the 1840s. Many of them had passed away, but instead met their children, grandchildren, Douglas was particularly pleased to see some members of the Richardson family in Newcastle, who had obviously been present and been supportive of him since the 1840s. And he actually said about the Richardsons, "If I had no other compensation for my voyage across the sea, this would have been ample payment." And I just read you an excerpt of one of his writings where he reflects on his trip to Ireland. So he says, "Leaving public persons, of whom many more could be mentioned, I turned to the precious friends from whom I parted at the end of my first visit to Great Britain and Ireland. In Dublin, the first city I then visited, I was kindly received by Mr. Richard Webb, Richard Allen, James Halton, and others. They were now all gone, and except some of their children, I was among strangers. They received me in the same cordial spirit that distinguished their fathers and mothers. I did not visit dear old Cork, where in 1845 I was made welcome by the Jennings, the Warings, the Wrights, and their circle of friends, most of whom I learned had passed away. The same was true of the Neils, the Workmans, the McIntyres, and the Nelsons at Belfast. I had friends in Limerick, in Waterford, and other towns of Ireland, but I saw none of them during this visit. What was true of the mortality of my friends in Ireland was equally true of those in England. Few who first received me in that country are now among the living. It was, however, my good fortune to meet once more the Richardsons, as I mentioned just now." And he goes on to say about Anna Richardson, "Having reached the good old age of 86 years, her life marvellously filled up with good works, for her hand was never idle, and her heart and brain were always active in the cause of peace and benevolence." A few days before this writing passed away. Miss Ellen Richardson, now over 80, still lives and continues to take a lively interest in the career of the man whose freedom she was instrumental in procuring. It was a great privilege once more to look into the faces and hear the voices of these noble and benevolent women. But going back to Ireland, he did actually visit Wilhelmina Webb in July 1887, timing his visit perfectly so the families, as Webb described, would scatter for the holidays. So he visited her sister Anna Webb Shackleton, Henry and Hannah Wigham, Lydia Shackleton, and reminisced with Susanna Fisher, who had previously lived in Limerick, so one of the friends that Douglas was just mentioning. And reflecting on his trip as a whole, he marvelled at the sights he had seen in Europe, but regretfully wrote that it has all come too late in life. I should have travelled thus when I was younger and my ambition for achievements was more vigorous. And this particular statement has a very melancholic tone, sort of imagining and implying and imagining sort of an alternative life, one that he could have embarked upon such travels without pouring all his energies into the unceasing fight against slavery and the legacies of slavery. But the issue that most severely tested Douglas's warm regard for the British people as a whole was that of Irish Home Rule. So in addressing this really divisive political question, Douglas reminisced about the friendly support that both nations had given him during the abolitionist crusade. He acknowledged that some of his British friends, like John Bright, actually opposed Home Rule for Ireland and admitted that the spirit of the age does not favour small nationalities. But nevertheless, in his speeches and writings, Douglas threw his support behind Irish Home Rule. He reversed his assessment of William Gladstone, who he'd harshly denounced during the Civil War for sympathising with Confederate independence. And following his, this third visit to Britain in the midst of the Home Rule debate, Douglas applauded Gladstone for favouring the rule of justice instead of the rule of the bayonet, the rule of love instead of the rule of hate, the rule of trust and confidence instead of the rule of doubt and suspicion. And in an article for the Commonwealth magazine, Douglas endorsed the passage of Home Rule because the glory of England will cease to be soiled with shame for the grievances of Ireland. And Ireland will be put upon her good behaviour before the world and made responsible for her own good or ill condition. And in his advocacy for the Irish, Douglas found ways to simultaneously advance the cause of African Americans as well, saying, "The right that I'm claiming for Ireland, I claim for every man here, north and south." And as he'd done his entire public career, Douglas tied the Irish cause to universal principles of human rights. "I am for the fair play for the Irishman, the Negro, the Chinaman, and all for all men of whatever country or clime, and for allowing them to work out their own destiny without outside interference." So Douglas returned to the US in early August 1887. And just to dwell for a minute on the images that you're looking at on the screen on the left-hand side, that's from the Maria Webb scrapbook. This is from Douglas's third visit to Ireland. And on the right hand side is essentially a ticket to Frederick Douglass's lecture, the one that he gave in St. Neots. So just to sort of draw this talk to a close then, so in the remaining few years of Douglas's life, British and Irish correspondents wrote to Douglas sharing news of former abolitionists, travels, political matters, family gossip, recent meetings, expressing the sorrow and the death of husbands and wives and children, grandchildren, illness, difficult trials, shared anxiety about the health of family members, and obviously the death too of long-lasting friends. So after Mary Carpenter from Bridport lost her husband, Russell Carpenter, in 1892, again, they've both been lifelong supporters of Douglas, she wrote of the depth of sorrow she experienced, but actually promised to send Douglas a photograph in memory of him. Now, on the 20th of February, 1895, Frederick Douglass died in Anacostia, and the news was reported around the world. And the British press in particular clamored to write obituaries to the most famous African-American at that point, an activist who had really had an impact on Britain and Ireland. And British and transatlantic friends who were staying in Britain and Ireland at that particular point paid tribute to his legacy. And at the Sturge Lodge Independent Order of Good Templars in Birmingham, the African-American activist, the Reverend Peter T. Stanford, actually delivered a eulogy about Frederick Douglass, and a resolution after his speech was passed, which said that Douglas's name will always be held in sacred keeping by us and by all lovers of liberty throughout the world. And I love that expression, the lovers of liberty, and I think it's a very apt phrase, because today the lovers of liberty continue to preserve Douglas's legacy across the globe, his life, testimony, and unrelenting fight against racism and white supremacy reinvigorate new ways of activists, as we saw 2 years ago with the Black Lives Matter protests on both sides of the Atlantic in the US and in the UK. And his inspiring intellectual vision, the numerous sacrifices that he and his family too made for the anti-slavery cause, the thousands of miles, the hundreds of thousands of miles he traveled, and the incalculable number of words written or spoken for the social justice movement invites us to hope that we will one day hopefully live in a more equal and just world that he spent his life campaigning for. Thank you so much, and I really appreciate you listening.
Thank you so much for that wonderful talk, Hannah Rose. Really great to hear you discuss all these amazing topics, and I'm really struck by that phrase, lovers of liberty. I think it's an amazing phrase, and I think you're quite right to bring it back to the present as well. But it just got me thinking about how Douglas would have used those transatlantic abolitionist networks during his trips, whenever he was here the first time and the second time. And I know you talked a little bit about how those connections continued, you know, with the letters and the exchanges and stuff, but it would be great if you could talk a bit more about that.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's been really interesting when I was reading a lot of the transatlantic correspondence, like particularly from the 1880s and the 1890s, because from his first trip in 1845, he really did create friends for life who really helped him privately sustain his work, his sort of political work as well. And that first trip in 1845 was so important for that. And you know, just to give you an example, at the time of his first visit, he was working with the radical white abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison. And Garrison had a lot of friends sort of around Britain and Ireland. So that meant that because Douglas was aligned with Garrison, he was introduced to a lot of Garrison's friends. So he went to stay with Richard D. Webb in Dublin, who printed his slave narrative. And a lot of Garrison's friends and contacts were, you know, newspaper editors, journalists, merchants, very key and influential people that could get the message or the anti-slavery message out. And Ireland is such a good example for this, because Webb introduced Douglas to his friends and to his cousins, and then across Ireland. So Douglas went and stayed with those people, who then arranged anti-slavery meetings for him. Fees for certain venues were waived, and Richard D. Webb is really impressed in with the initial sales of Douglas's narrative, because he gets through a load just through private networks, just through literally circulating them through friends and friends of friends and family members. So those kinship networks and friendship networks were so important that when Douglas gets to England, he stays with the Richardson family, he stays with Eliza Wigham in Edinburgh, the Estlin family in Bristol, and all of whom really maximise the anti-slavery cause, in part because they have connections to newspapers that print favourable coverage of Douglas's lectures. So it's really, really important. And then just to sort of finish up on that point, when Douglas travels to England for the second time in 1859, because he'd actually broken with the Garrisonian wing of the anti-slavery movement, he mainly speaks in the north of England and also Scotland. He doesn't go to Bristol, for example, where the Estlin family are based, because the Estlin family are still aligned with Garrison, and they write some very horrible things and racist things about Douglas. They don't want him to come to Bristol. So he's slightly sort of restricted a bit more about where he can speak, but he still manages to create a lot of anti-slavery momentum, in part because he's a brilliant speaker and he's a brilliant organizer and an activist, but also because he's working in tandem with abolitionists like Julia Griffiths-Crofts, who also have relationships with the press and newspapers, and can really get that word out.
Yeah, it's so fascinating, Hannah Rose, to see the network at work and to see how, it's spread across Ireland and the UK and everywhere, really. It's really fascinating to see also how it develops over time, right? I think for maybe a lot of people who are listening and tuning in today, it's often like a surprise to people that Douglas actually came back, twice, and then how different the experience was and how his life had developed. And I think he did such an amazing job just outlining that, and I want to know so much more. And it's so great to really dive into this with you, Hannah Rose. And I was thinking, I was thinking about your research in general. I know we've had many conversations about Moses Roper, for example, and other abolitionists, and the research that you have done with the mapping project. And I really encourage everyone to go and check it out. It's so interesting and so great to see where all the people spoke and where they went. And I'm wondering, in that context, we're last year we're talking a lot about Douglas's trip to Ireland in the 1840s. We talked about the two other trips to Ireland and the UK. Now, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about other abolitionists that traveled maybe at the same time, before, after, and I'm, for example, really curious to find out who else was traveling in the 60s and the 80s, and because things had changed, especially post-slavery. And I'm just wondering if you could say a few words about that.
Yeah, thank you for that. So the short answer was that is that we don't know exactly how many were traveling in the 1850s and 1860s, but there were many activists that definitely made their mark, as well as Frederick Douglass by the late 1850s. So in the talk I mentioned Sarah Parker Remond. She was a radical activist. She led a very successful anti-slavery lecturing tour at the end of 1858, 1859, and in the early 1860s as well. She actually lived in London for a brief period of time before she went to settle in Italy for the rest of her life. But she traveled around the north of England. She revived anti-slavery societies. She created new ones. She had such a huge impact on the anti-slavery cause, when we have to remember she, at the time, thinking about racial and gender dynamics, she was an African-American woman speaking on a political stage about a political matter, when it was incredibly difficult for women, let alone Black women, to speak on a public stage. So she was really smashing all of those stereotypes and gender and racial dynamics as well. There are so many people that I could talk about. I mean, during the Civil War, there were certain African Americans who traveled specifically to Britain to try and encourage that level of support that I was mentioning, to encourage that level of support for the Union, and actually talking about what the Confederacy really stood for. So you had William Henry Jackson, who was the enslaved coachman of Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy. So he went to a lot of the areas that were affected by the cotton famine amongst white sort of working class men and women. And he was saying, obviously, despite the fact that you're living in such really difficult conditions, let me tell you what it's like to be enslaved. It's a completely different experience, but also despite the conditions that you're suffering, you should still support the Union, because slavery in the Confederacy is inherently an evil institution. And the other thing that I'm sort of focusing and writing on at the moment, so if I have something to say, maybe I can do this next year, is some activists that we don't necessarily know loads about. So two men that I'm researching at the moment are Washington Duff and James Cheney Thompson, who specifically sort of spurned white Western white supremacist sort of literary practices and refused to learn to read and write, but instead talked about their story on anti-slavery stages, painted and illustrated their experience of slavery through panoramas, paintings, drawings they exhibited to audiences. So essentially visualizing their experience of enslavement, their experiences of torture, showing images of them being tortured, showing images of family members who either died, experienced violence, or who they no longer knew whether they were alive or dead because of their escape. So thinking about those voices as well, and particularly those voices that chose not to write their experiences down. And again, just to sort of finish on sort of the other part of your question, because by the end of the US Civil War in 1865, technically abolition was sort of legally enacted, but obviously those legacies of slavery were still continuing. So the other fascinating part of the story, which links to the mapping that you very kindly mentioned, is that there were so many African Americans who were still coming after the end of the Civil War to talk about segregation, the convict leasing system, the lynching of Black women and men and children across the southern states, but also across the US as a whole. The incredibly high rates of incarceration of Black women, men and children as well. And you had folks like Josiah Henson, who came in the 1870s. He worked with John Lobb, the reformer and journalist I mentioned earlier. You had religious ministers and educators who were coming in the 1870s and the 1880s to raise money for churches, Black community venues, but also schools for Black children across the US South in particular. You had Ida B. Wells Barnett, who traveled here twice in 1893 and 1894 to specifically campaign against lynching and segregation as well. Hallie Quinn Brown did the same. She came over several times in the 1890s to campaign against racism, segregation, the convict lease system. And just finally, you also had men like D.E. Tobias and Benjamin William Brown, who actually penned post-war slave narratives that were published in the UK, in England, that aren't looked at whatsoever. And they talk about Brown talks about his experience of enslavement. He enlisted in the Union Army during the Civil War, and he talks about what he was doing after that. And then Tobias specifically talks about how the convict lease system and the high numbers of incarceration of Black women, men and children are a direct result of slavery. So these very powerful, the radical documents and speeches as well that made an impact decades after the Civil War and decades after Douglas's first visit in 1845.
Thank you so much, Hannah Rose. I can already tell that you're mentioning it there. I think we'll have a lot to talk about for Douglas Week 2023 next year. I think I could go on for hours. I know, Sarah, you probably also have a lot more questions, but I think that this is always so insightful, these conversations with you, Hannah Rose, and very, very, very grateful that you took the time to share your expertise, your knowledge, your extensive knowledge, and your research with us today. Like I said, can't wait for more and to hear more from you and what you will uncover and discover. Like you said, I think there's so much we don't know yet and so much we still need to find out. And yeah, thank you so much for this really insightful talk, Hannah Rose. Thank you for being with us. Happy Douglas Week, and also happy Black History Month in the US. And I really appreciate you being here. So thank you so much from my side, and I hand over to Sarah for the last few words.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Hannah Rose. This has been amazing. Happy Douglas Week, everyone. And I think it's great to see when you're talking there about these networks and transatlantic networks, to see the kind of knock-on effect of this work and this activism. And that's obviously something that we want to really continue with Douglas Week, this collaboration, this connectedness. And we're just so happy to have you as a Douglas Week collaborator and part of the Douglas Week team. So thank you for being here. Happy Douglas Week, everyone. Don't forget to subscribe to us on YouTube, and we'll see you again very soon with more events on this wonderful day 2. Thank you.